The morning air at Fort Moore smelled like pine needles and gun oil. Rows of long shooting benches stretched across the southern range. All pointed toward a target so distant it appeared more illusion than object. The red dot at its center shimmered faintly in the heat, rising off the clay-packed soil. By 07:15, every station was occupied. Snipers from different branches of the military rangers, SEALs, Marines, special tactics operators had gathered for what the instructors called the impossibility drill. It was not a competition, but it felt like one. Beside each shooter stood a range officer with a notepad. Behind them, a colonel with a weathered jawline checked his watch and gave curt nods. Men spoke in short bursts, technical terms flaring between them like code. Grace Maddox moved through the perimeter unnoticed. Her uniform was clean but lacked insignia that mattered to these men. The badge clipped to her chest read, Logistics Coordinator, Civilian Support Division. She wore it like armor. A clipboard rested in her left hand, its surface blank aside from a few scribbled stock numbers and initials. She marked inventory and serials without ever needing to look twice. Every movement was smooth, silent, unremarkable. No one asked her what she was doing there. A couple of younger soldiers gave her a once-over and kept talking. She passed close enough to hear someone mutter about admin staff wasting their weekend, but she didn't react. She paused by a stack of sealed crates, labeled 7.62mm, match grade, and scanned each with a handheld laser. Her fingers lingered briefly on the casing of a high-precision tripod, then moved on. At the far end of the line, a team of shooters tested wind readings with handheld anemometers and flags staked at 100-meter intervals. Wind had shifted twice since dawn, gusts coming hard off the western tree line before curling into inconsistent shears mid-range. The snipers adjusted scopes, recalibrated zero stops, noted down values. Some did it from memory. Others checked apps or printouts. Grace watched them from the corner of her eye. She tracked hand positions, timing between shots, how long each man lingered behind the scope before squeezing the trigger. She made no notes. Her lips pressed into a faint line as the first round cracked downrange and landed 3 feet off target. She stepped back and disappeared behind a row of storage lockers without a sound. No one questioned why she drifted closer to the firing line as the test continued. She moved like someone who had always belonged, yet knew better than to be seen. When a young Marine glanced at her and whispered something to his buddy, they both snorted and turned away. Grace kept her eyes forward. At 07:42, the commanding officer raised a megaphone and addressed the line. This wasn't about hitting the target, he said. This was about pushing the edge of their understanding, knowing the outer limit of a weapon system, of body and breath, and knowing when to hold fire. A few heads nodded, others grinned like they'd already figured it out. Grace stood at the far end of the line, half-shadowed beneath the canopy, unnoticed. Her posture relaxed, her gaze still. She didn't react as more rounds cracked and missed, didn't flinch when dust kicked up just meters from the distant frame. She glanced toward the wind flags once more, her eyes moving in sequence like clock hands. She didn't need to be close to see. She already knew. That's why she stood so far back, watching the entire field with detachment. She was measuring things they weren't, not just wind and drop and drift, but something finer. Movement between movements, gonna occur the rhythm beneath the... The shooting continued. Men recalibrated, grunted, laughed it off. Someone called a break at Aero 800. As the crowd shifted and trainers pulled shooters into small groups for feedback, Grace returned to her post near the ammunition crates and picked up her clipboard. She checked off a box beside a number no one else had seen her write. She waited, quiet, invisible, intentional, not hiding, not exactly, just biding her time. The first shooter to the line was a Marine Scout sniper with 2 combat deployments and a quiet reputation. He lay prone behind a Barrett MRAD chambered in .338 Lapua Magnum, scope dialed to maximum magnification. The wind was pulling right to left at 14 knots near the deck. But gusts near the mid-range markers created uneven pressure bands. His spotter murmured values as the sniper adjusted windage and elevation. At 0807, the round cracked and vanished into distance. Observers tracked the vapor trail. Impact landed wide, maybe 2.5 meters off center. The Marine rolled back and exhaled slowly. No frustration, just data. Another shooter prepped next without waiting. A SEAL from DevGru, clean-cut and overconfident, took a different approach. He called out each variable like it was a classroom demo. He'd hit targets at 2,000 meters before, and it showed. But at 3,000, the rules changed. The bullet's trajectory arced longer than most snipers ever planned for. Coriolis effect played its part, as did mirage distortion and barometric inconsistency. The SEAL fired at 0813, missed by nearly 3 meters. His face hardened, but he said nothing. More came. A Ranger captain, an Air Force PJ, a retired Marine gunnery sergeant who now trained foreign units. All of them used MRAD platforms or modified M2010 enhanced sniper rifles. A few switched to 300 Norma Magnum, hoping for tighter performance. None of it mattered. The wind played tricks at 1,800 meters and again at 2,600. Flags fluttered in 3 directions along the line. By 0835, no one had landed closer than 1.9 meters. A few shooters blamed optics or ammunition lots. Others chalked it up to heat shimmer or subtle terrain shift. The instructors, watching from a small command tent with binoculars and whiteboards, began making notes that sounded less technical and more psychological. They spoke about threshold comprehension, how some shooters didn't understand what impossible really looked like. Near the ammo crates, Grace Maddox stood behind a reinforced pallet and made a note on her clipboard. It wasn't about inventory. Her eyes tracked how each sniper controlled their breath during the final second before pulling. Most overcorrected for the 3rd flag set. One forgot to compensate for scope cant. None of them paused long enough to read the upper atmosphere. A younger Army sergeant, leaning against a Pelican case, nodded toward Grace and muttered something about civvies trying to look important. His buddy snorted and said logistics never hit paper beyond 25 meters. Grace kept her back to them and didn't react. She moved slightly left, angling her line of sight to catch the shimmer rising off the dirt in Zone Delta. Then she checked another box and walked away. By 0847, the group looked different, less confident. The sun was higher now, and the shadows sharper. Rounds were expended. Fewer spotters were smiling. The colonel stepped forward, calm as ever, and said the point wasn't about making the shot. It was about understanding why it couldn't be done. The range fell quiet. Grace didn't look up. She'd heard it before. Her expression never changed. She moved toward the maintenance shed at the rear of the line, clipboard still in hand. No one noticed her leave. At exactly 08:59, just as the range commander was about to call an end to the morning session, a single shot cracked through the humid air. It was sharper than the previous reports, less drawn out, more decisive. Heads turned instinctively, but no one had seen a shooter prone or a weapon fired. Spotters shifted to their scopes, almost on reflex. A moment passed. Then came a murmur, low and scattered, as someone gasped. The target, a steel silhouette 3,000 meters out, had taken a direct hit, right through the center plate, clean, undeniable, and impossible. Everything stopped. Conversation, movement, even the wind seemed to hesitate. Instructors exchanged glances. One picked up a radio, calling security to confirm perimeter lockdown. The command tent scrambled. No sniper had been cleared to fire at that moment. No one had called their shot. Within minutes, personnel were moving along the line, checking weapons, magazines, and logs. Nobody had chambered a round. Nobody was missing one. A staff sergeant barked at the nearest range safety officer to verify muzzle flags. All were down. No one was supposed to be shooting. An older sniper muttered under his breath, something about someone firing from the tree line. Spotters scanned the ridges. Thermal drones in standby mode lit up and cleared sectors. Nothing. No heat signatures outside of cleared range personnel. No movement beyond the wire. Inside the command tent, a whiteboard filled with earlier wind patterns and fail zones now had a question mark sketched next to the bullseye. A lieutenant began recalculating known drop patterns for 338 Lapua and 300 Norma loads. None of them aligned with the current conditions. Nothing explained the shot. Then, someone pointed. A young corporal, face pale, lifted his arm toward the far side of the range near the maintenance shed. He said he saw her standing there, logistics clerk. Brown hair pulled back. Same one with the clipboard. She had stepped out from the shadows and raised something to her shoulder. The others followed his line of sight. Grace Maddox stood near a stack of Pelican cases, still holding her clipboard. The M110A1 SDMR rested on the ground beside her, muzzle down, ejection port open, no scope modification, no spotter. She didn't say a word. One of the instructors stormed over, demanding answers. Grace simply nodded. She'd logged the shot under her own serial tracking sheet. Same weapon issued to support staff. Standard 7.62 NATO match rounds from the sealed crate 2 rows back. No modifications. No assistance. The colonel arrived moments later. He stared at her, then down at the M110A1, then back up. His voice dropped when he asked who gave her clearance. She didn't answer at first, then said she didn't need any. She had waited until the line was clear. No shooters downrange. Conditions stable. Safety protocols met. No one spoke after that. The realization settled in slow and heavy. Not just that she'd fired the shot, but that it hit. That it made every failed attempt before it feel smaller. There was no boasting. No celebration. Just a woman in standard fatigues, standing alone beside a spent casing, and the target still vibrating in the distance. The colonel took the ID from her hand with more suspicion than ceremony. He flipped it open, glancing at the name and barcode, then back at her. Her expression didn't change. She stood still, arms relaxed at her sides, clipboard tucked under her elbow. He scanned the embedded chip using a secure reader from the operations tent. The confirmation screen blinked once, then loaded. It took him longer than expected to process what he saw. The air around them thickened, one by one. The instructors nearby leaned closer to catch fragments. The name on the screen read, Maddox, Grace E., rank captain, status active clearance, Tier 1, Bravo, assignment, formally, Orion program, JSO key, Black Branch. The last line was enough. Orion had never officially existed. A few of the older operators shifted their weight, murmuring low. One SEAL commander narrowed his eyes and mouthed the word ghost. Another, a recon marine with 4 tours, just exhaled like a weight had dropped in his chest. Someone muttered about a mission in Mali that was never publicly confirmed. Another asked if this was the woman who took 3 targets at nearly 2 miles through fog. She didn't confirm anything. She didn't need to. The colonel's shoulders squared slightly as he handed the ID back. He nodded once, slower this time. Then he turned to the others and raised his voice. What you just saw, he said, was no accident. Captain Maddox holds 27 confirmed eliminations beyond 2,500 meters, all within operational parameters. 0 missed engagements. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't need to. The tone had shifted. The young sniper who'd laughed earlier stared at the dirt. One of the instructors took a single step backward, like he was recalibrating the space around her. Grace looked at no one in particular. She didn't correct them. She didn't thank them. A staff sergeant stepped forward, clearing his throat. He asked if she had used her own system. She shook her head. M110A1. Off the rack. No spotter. Factory optic. Just breath, timing, and environment. The sergeant blinked and stepped back. For a few seconds, nothing moved. The range flags rustled in the background. The target, still swaying from impact, seemed like a distant echo of the silence. Grace turned and walked toward the crates without another word. The colonel watched her go, then looked back at the gathered men. Dismissed, he said quietly. They didn't leave right away. Most stayed rooted to the ground, eyes following her like they were seeing her for the first time. Because they were. Whatever assumptions they'd held about rank, appearance, or role had just been erased by a single, impossible shot. She hadn't changed, but everything around her had. It was Fallujah, not the headline kind of mission, not one that would ever make its way into a citation or a briefing to Congress. Just another Thursday, tucked deep inside the walls of a hostile district, with a window of less than 4 minutes. The target was a senior planner for a regional terror cell, a man who'd orchestrated IED supply lines through civilian corridors. Intelligence had tracked him to a third-story window above a bakery. She was told it was clean. No non-combatants. No secondary contacts. Grace lay in the dirt on a rooftop almost 2,700 meters away. Her spotter couldn't see through the haze. The wind pushed and pulled like it didn't know which way it wanted to go. But she had spent years learning how to read that kind of drift without needing instruments. She ran the numbers, then ran them again. Her margin was clean. The window opened at 14:16. The round took just under 3 seconds to reach the target. She heard the distant crack through her comms, followed by silence. Spotter called impact, center mass, clean exit. They exfiltrated within 6 minutes, no complications. The operation was classified as successful. 2 days later, she learned that the security detail beside the target hadn't been professional muscle. They were his sons, 17 and 15, both armed. Both recorded carrying rifles in prior drone footage. Still, both teenagers. The younger had been carrying bread into the room. The older reached for a sidearm when the first shot dropped their father. Grace didn't argue. She didn't write a report. She didn't speak during debrief. She signed the mission log, submitted her rifle, and requested immediate reassignment. No one asked why. They already knew. People in her position didn't quit. Not unless something cracked. When the logistics paperwork came through 2 weeks later, she was already packed. No one from her old unit came to say goodbye. No one needed to. Ghosts don't mourn other ghosts. They just disappear. Now, standing behind crates on a quiet range years later, she could still feel the weight of that decision. Not the shot. The numbers were perfect. Ballistics, elevation, wind shear. No error. What broke her wasn't the distance or the noise. It was the fact that she'd trusted the intel, that she believed the target was alone, that she'd believed she could ever know enough. Grace never told anyone the full story. She never needed to. The silence she carried with her was louder than any confession. Every time she looked at a rifle, she didn't see the steel or the optics. She saw a cracked window, a boy holding a loaf of bread, and her own finger tightening against a cold trigger. Not hesitation, not regret, just accuracy in its purest and most unforgiving form. Colonel Crowley found her alone in the gear shed just after 17 WU. The rest of the range had cleared out. Ammunition was locked up, rifles racked. Grace was checking the final box on a supply ledger when he stepped inside. He didn't waste time. He said her name, rank, and file designation. Then he offered her a choice. Not deployment. Not covert. Just instruction. He called it what it was. A chance to train the next wave, to pass on what others couldn't teach because they didn't understand it. He kept his tone professional, but underneath it was something else. Respect. Not the ceremonial kind. The kind that only shows up when someone sees something they can't explain and knows better than to challenge it. Grace didn't answer right away. She closed the ledger, placed it on the shelf, and stood in silence for a long minute. Then she told him no. She wasn't interested. Not in being a symbol. Not in standing at a podium. She said she came here to be invisible, and she'd like to keep it that way. Crowley didn't push. He nodded once and walked out. The door swung closed behind him, and the echo felt heavier than it should have. The next morning, Grace stood at the edge of the range by 0630. She wasn't sure why she'd come back early. Habit, maybe. The sun was low, wind still calm. Rows of benches were already occupied by young shooters adjusting their gear and checking rifle bolts. The same crew who had watched her from a distance yesterday now sat in tighter clusters. No one looked directly at her, but no one joked either. At 0700, the exercise began again. The instructors called it Day 2 of impossible shot drills, but the atmosphere was different. The men approached their stations with a little less swagger. A few checked their assumptions before speaking out loud. Grace stood off to the side, near the observation tent, watching. An Army private named Thorne had been the worst shot the day before. His grouping had landed outside the zone altogether. He was back now, focused, lips moving as he recited wind values. Grace noticed how long he stared through his scope. He was overcorrecting, just like they all had. She stepped forward. She didn't ask permission. She just walked to his bench and knelt beside him. He looked at her, startled, then confused. She asked if he could feel the difference in the breeze on the back of his neck versus his cheek. He hesitated. She told him to stop calculating and start sensing. Feel the ground. Listen to the shift in air. Breathe with it, not around it. The spotter nearby raised an eyebrow but didn't interrupt. Grace reached for the adjustment dial and turned it one click without speaking. Then she stepped back and told Thorne to fire when it felt right. No math, no second guessing. He waited. 10 seconds. 20. Then he exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger. The round cracked across the range. Spotters tracked it. The steel target at 3,000 meters rang with a sharp, clean note. The impact was 0.4 meters from center. The instructors stared. No one said anything. Grace didn't smile. She didn't nod. She just turned and walked back to where she'd been standing. Behind her, Thorne sat stunned. One of the older snipers let out a quiet breath and muttered that he'd never even considered wind layering in that way. Another whispered that maybe the legend was real after all. Crowley stepped forward, hands behind his back. He didn't speak to her, not directly. He just addressed the group. Training had officially shifted. From now on, Captain Maddox would be leading the advanced sessions. If anyone had questions about why, he said they could ask the target downrange. Grace remained still. Her arms were folded across her chest, but something in her posture had changed. She wasn't fading into the background anymore. She wasn't hiding in checklists or storage duties. She'd crossed a line without meaning to. The silence that had protected her for years was no longer enough. By the end of that morning, 6 others had asked for her to check their firing stance. 2 asked how she'd handled terrain distortion in the morning light. 1 just asked if he could sit beside her for a few minutes before his shot. She didn't answer everything. She just watched, listened, corrected when needed. And for the first time in a long time, she let herself be seen, not as a ghost, but as someone who still had something to give. By 06:05, the southern range at Fort Moore looked nothing like it had 6 months ago. Gone were the lines of whiteboards and the rigid cadence of command voice instruction. There were no lectures, no overhead projections of wind data or formulas on paper. Captain Grace Maddox had replaced them with movement, intuition, and silence. Sniper candidates no longer sat in rows. They walked. They read the dirt. They ran drills barefoot at dawn to feel ground temperature shifts before thermal pockets formed. They hiked uphill with sandbags to learn breath under pressure, then lay prone for hours, not to fire, but to listen. Grace didn't tell them what to see. She asked what they missed. She'd changed too. Not in uniform or voice, but in how she stood. Her shoulders were still square, her voice still measured, but she no longer disappeared behind clipboards. She walked the line each morning, nodding at students by name, pointing once at sky movement or flag drag. The students leaned in closer when she did. Her authority didn't shout. It arrived and stayed. Avery Lee arrived in Cycle 3, 5'3", barely 120 pounds, former archer from Oregon State, scored top percentile in optics recognition and terrain reading. Still rejected on her first application for lacking physical presence, Grace reviewed the file twice, then pulled her in personally. Avery struggled in her first month. Not with aim, but with space. The rifles were long, the positions rigid. She was quick, but tense. She tried too hard to copy others. Grace sat beside her one evening after range shutdown. No speech. Just placed a pebble in Avery's palm and said, if she could feel the direction the wind came from without watching a flag, she'd be ready. Then walked away. Avery kept that pebble. Every morning, she would close her eyes and let it rest between her fingers. She stopped watching the others. She started feeling the shifts. Her grouping improved. Then her timing. Then came the trust. By mid-cycle, Avery had been cleared to attempt a 800-meter engagement. The instructors said it was optimistic. Grace said nothing. She simply walked with her that morning at 05:30. They arrived early. Dew still clung to the ground. Wind rolled low and wide. Avery prepped the Mk-22 ASR herself. She had selected 300 Norma Magnum for the conditions, mounted with a Sig Sauer Tango 6T16X scope, the same platform that had frustrated stronger shooters all month. She cleaned the glass, locked the bipod, loaded a single round, then lay still. No commands were given. The range had already gone quiet. Word had spread. Half the instructor corps stood behind the brush line, observing without speaking. A few of them had doubted her earlier. Now they waited. Grace knelt beside her and scanned the upper drift with bare eyes, then looked at Avery. No instructions. Just presence. Avery whispered a small breath and closed her eyes for 2 full seconds, then locked behind the scope. At 06:52, the wind shifted once, brushing her cheekbone left to right. She adjusted elevation 2 clicks, windage 3, no spotter, no second glance, just years of discipline repurposed into the breath she took before squeezing the trigger. The round cracked. The steel plate nearly 2 miles out rang like a slow bell. The ping didn't echo. It cut clean, precise, like the moment had waited for it. Avery stayed prone. She didn't celebrate, just exhaled. One of the instructors dropped his coffee without realizing it. Another stepped forward and whispered her name, then caught himself. Grace stood slowly. She didn't touch Avery's shoulder. She didn't smile. She looked downrange, then nodded once. The target vibrated faintly in the wind. That evening, the students packed up in silence. Avery stayed behind, wiping down the bolt, checking the chamber. Grace stood beside her, arms folded. Finally, she said the shot wasn't just perfect. It was necessary, not for the score, but for the memory it would become. That was what this place was now. Not a testing ground, a memory forge. Each shot left behind something unspoken but permanent. The instructors no longer corrected posture with barked orders. They asked questions. They quoted Grace. They carried her style without knowing it. At 19:10, as the sun dipped behind the far ridge, Grace stood alone on the platform, watching the last rays arc across the zone. She wasn't thinking about the shot, not about the target or the rifle. She was thinking about Fallujah, about the moment accuracy had broken something in her, and how today, For the first time, that same accuracy had built something instead. Avery walked by, nodded, and said she'd see her at 500. Grace didn't answer right away. She turned, nodded once, then looked back down the long stretch of sand and flag and sky. The wind had shifted again, subtle, low, dragging across the edge of the terrain. She didn't need to check a chart. She could feel it. He found her just after 12:40 outside the weather canopy behind the long-range tower. CIA advisor Marcus Albright didn't wear a name tag. He didn't need one. His presence said everything before he opened his mouth. The clean boots, the stillness in his voice, the manila folder in his hand. It wasn't a request about ammo resupply. Grace didn't invite him to sit. She leaned against the wooden rail, arms crossed, eyes tracking a dry heat wave rolling off the gravel. He spoke quietly. Situation unfolding in Belarus. Not confirmed, not public, but close. Something about rogue assets. Advanced optics moving into black market channels. Ex-Orion contractors surfacing in the wrong hemisphere. She didn't flinch. When he asked her to come back, she told him no. She wasn't hunting ghosts anymore. Albright said it wasn't that. Said they just needed her eyes. Her instincts. Nothing kinetic. Just consultation. Her thoughts on angle, terrain, timing. Advice from someone who could still hit a hummingbird's wing at 2 miles. She told him she'd think about it. That evening, range drills went quiet by 18:00. The sun dipped hard behind the west hill. Most of the students were clearing their rifles, calling out chamber flags, laughing over tight groupings and missed marks. Grace stood alone at the edge of the range, eyes scanning the final line. Avery Lee was packing her MK-22 slow and precise. For a moment, Grace just watched her. She saw the way Avery moved, calm, settled, present, not trying to prove anything. Just there, fully there. The same way Grace used to be before decisions got heavier than the gear. Avery looked up. Their eyes met. She didn't smile, just gave a small, clean nod. Grace held it in her chest for a second. That nod, that unspoken handoff, the kind that doesn't need applause or permission. That was it. Not legacy, not passing a torch. Just clarity. She wasn't leaving something behind. She was making space for it to keep growing. Later that night, she called Albright from the radio tower. She told him she'd advise, not deploy, not command. She'd consult under blackout channels. Technical only. One condition. She worked from Fort Moore. She stayed close to her people. He agreed. The next morning at 05:15, the field was empty. First light hadn't cracked yet. The wind was still asleep. Grace walked out across the firing zone with her hands in her jacket pockets. No clipboard, no rifle, just her boots pressing into the earth. She didn't walk to disappear. She walked because she chose to. The range was hers again. Not to control, just to walk freely. For the first time in years, she felt no weight on her back. At the far bench, she paused and looked downrange. The wind stirred lightly across the flags. No targets had been set yet. Just space, just air and time. She stood there for a long while, watching it move. Not hiding, choosing.